Senator Alex Antic, Senator for South Australia, currently in Canberra for the sitting week. Thanks for squeezing us in and joining us on Flow.
Thanks, Ricky.
Now, we spoke a short while ago about censorship online and the social media and other tech giants, Google, Facebook, Twitter, what have you. They starting to control what people can and can't say online. Been a really interesting development out of the United Kingdom that's probably down the line of what we were talking about previously.
Yeah, look, it's interesting seeing how, I guess, the laws in other countries are starting to develop. I think certainly in many of the Western liberal democracies, the laws are starting to catch up, or at least the beginnings of them are, which is encouraging. In the UK, in particular, we're now seeing reports that the United Kingdom government is going to start to introduce some anti-censorship laws into a suite of laws relating to cyber safety. So, the idea would be to sort of clamp down on some of the censorship stuff that we're seeing, things like people being shadow banned and deplatformed for various views, whatever the views might be, which is encouraging. It sort of follows, relatively hot on the heels of countries like Poland, who earlier in the year, late last year, introduced some similar but different legislation dealing with the way in which social media companies censor. And I think in Poland now there are some serious penalties that go along with removing posts that ultimately are proven to be factual, in the order of millions of euros, in fact. So there are some countries in the EU that are starting to get this and are starting to make strides in the right direction, I think. And it's one of the things that I hope happens here in Australia. I have been pushing for a while for a sort of a deep dive into this, if you say, a Senate Select Committee to look into what we need to do in Australia to protect our democracy as well, because we're not immune from it, and we've seen Facebook very recently pull the pin on the likes of Craig Kelly for talking about things relating to COVID, the vaccines, and indeed other treatments that might well, who knows, turn out to be based in a lot of facts. So very, very interesting, very new area and a very important area too.
Yeah, we'll come back to Craig Kelly and that topic in a minute. But the platform that UK have promoted have said they want to forbid, and these laws will forbid discriminating against particular political viewpoints, and will need to apply protections equally to a range of political opinions, no matter what their affiliation. And then they have also said they want the regulator to make sure these companies like Facebook should guard freedom of expression. Now, that's one of those human rights some of your Greens colleagues might talk about in the Senate chamber from time to time that is an important human right. So are we seeing here now not just something that's about politics, but actually about enshrining another human right and making sure it's protected online?
Well, look, I think, we certainly take, in this part of the world, we take freedom of speech pretty seriously. I hope it is. I hope that, we get to a position where it doesn't matter what your view is, you have the ability to express it. And I think some of the weapons that these social media companies use to censor views are by labelling them dangerous or labelling them conspiracy theories. And of course, we've seen instances where so-called conspiracy theories have turned out to be quite right. So, I think it is very dangerous when we have social media companies being the arbiters of free speech. And I think it's really important that government does take steps to try to find ways to make sure that that's not lost. One of the ways we used to do this in the era of print media was simply to have media ownership laws, and of course we still do that. But that's one way government has regulated the media space in the years gone by, trying to ensure that all the power doesn't rest in one set of hands. And at the moment, with big tech companies, sadly, the power rests in very, very few hands, and I think that's dangerous. Yeah,
so with what we're starting to see, say, with Facebook is kind of the manifestation of American domestic politics playing out on a global scale. And we look at what's happening in Florida. Apparently, the governor there has introduced a plan to make sure that platforms like Facebook can't deplatform a candidate. For our listeners who aren't familiar with the idea, what is deplatforming in the first place, and why do we need to ban Facebook from doing it?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, there are a whole lot of new words that have come up. Some of them have actually been generated, I think, and created by companies like Project Veritas, who claim it's a sort of a think tank in the US that claim to have coined the phrase shadow banning, which is another one. But deplatforming is really a term that's used to describe the process whereby social media platforms take away a person's right to speak. Now, in the case of social media, what that really means is pulling your account in the simplest form. So we've seen that a couple of times. The most famous example probably is what Twitter did to the president at the time, Donald Trump, who lost his Twitter account, was effectively deplatformed, and therefore given no opportunity to speak to his audience, regardless of whether you liked what he said or you didn't. It's given its origins in the university sector of 20 years ago, where students would simply disagree with a speaker and then lobby to have that person's event cancelled. And it's sort of the digital incarnation of that now, if you like. But of course, there are other tactics as well. Shadow banning's one, where supposedly the algorithms used by these companies hide people's existence, basically. So if you go searching for Ricky Lambert on Twitter, you wouldn't find him. He just doesn't exist. So they're very, very complicated, very, very tricky, and not overly exposed and known at this stage, but certainly it's a very, very important area.
And some of these reforms, like the Johnson government's doing in England, where they're talking about enshrining this freedom of expression right, sounds a lot like, when you mention universities, what's happening in Australia, where the Australian government is trying to push for universities to continue to be places where people can share opinions of all persuasions, whereas we've seen on university campuses a fairly heavy tilt towards in favour of left, socialist and even communist thinking, but very aggressively shutting out opinions of a more conservative persuasion.
That's right. Look, and universities have historically and should continue to be areas of contest of ideas, freedom of speech, and people bashing ideas together to try and get the right result. I mean, that's historically the idea for universities. But sadly, you're right, over the last few decades, that seems to be increasingly a foreign concept in some of these areas. We see it through the student bodies, and of course we see lots of anecdotes of students suggesting that they don't necessarily receive the best marks when they put conservative viewpoints through. So I think it is a bit of a problem for the university sector. It's something the government's working on, but ultimately it's a sort of a contagion that can't spread any further. And certainly, into these big companies, like big tech companies now that hold so much power in so little hands, it's something that governments have to be very, very cautious of.
Yeah, and that brings me to something you have talked about before, but I really want to zero in on this. You mentioned media ownership laws, and looking at Facebook and the influence it has in Australia. If it was a television station, you'd be saying, well, we want to make sure it's Australian owned. You talk about deplatforming. If you had, say, the ABC refusing to interview a political candidate in an election, or saying, well, we're just going to pretend that person's not even participating in the election, there'd be an absolute furor about media bias, and maybe there is one at the moment. But do we need that sort of regulation of a Facebook or a Twitter to make sure that they are operating or accountable like our media organisations are, to give everyone a fair go in politics?
Yeah, well, it's sort of, as you think you described earlier, the experience of the suggestion of what they're doing in Florida at the moment with the governor there, Ron DeSantis, who's proposing laws which do exactly that, make it a serious offence or a punishable offence, or to actually pull the pin on any political candidate, regardless of the persuasion or political party, off a social media site. So, and look, the point you make about having this sort of influence that's come from foreign hands in foreign social media companies, that's a very new thing. You're quite right. I mean, once upon a time, the media influence was, for the better part, largely Australian-owned. So, whatever the editorial viewpoint was an Australian one. Well, now we're seeing these large American companies, and increasingly there will be other foreign owners. It does present a very challenging space for legislators, and it's one of the reasons why I think it is really important that we do have a proper select committee style inquiry which fleshes out a lot of these issues. They're not simple issues. They're cross-jurisdictional, they're international, they're legal, there's social media. There's a whole bunch of issues that are swishing around in there, and it really does require a sort of a generational think, I think, about how we deal with it, because it's the way of the future.
Yeah, and a classic example of the way foreign politics or the politics of another country filters into Australia is when we look at America and the about-face of the Biden administration on the origins of coronavirus. Suddenly, even though Joe Biden and his administration were knocking over the Trump inquiries that he started into whether the virus originated there, and he was lambasted by the Democrat side of politics for suggesting the virus might have come out of Wuhan, now the Biden administration is willing to investigate that and calling on the WHO to go back and have a second look. Suddenly Facebook have declared, we're not going to ban people sharing that the virus might have been man-made. It was a conspiracy theory according to Facebook 2 weeks ago, and now they're saying, well, you can share that if you like.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And it's exactly what we were talking about earlier on about how dangerous this shadow banning or deplatforming or censoring of information can be, because, we've seen that very clearly here. 12 months ago, that was apparently, I don't know if it really was, but it was a conspiracy theory that this virus might have started in a Chinese lab. And of course, whatever information needed to get out, presumably, was being blocked by some of these sites. Now the Biden administration changes its mind, and so does social media. I mean, what's going on there? That is alarming in itself. So I think it does show the difference between needing to keep freedom of speech open. They will use the shield that we are protecting people from dangerous misinformation. This has become a new word as well. But it's very dangerous, because what you might think is misinformation and what I might think is misinformation might be something completely different to what somebody else might think is. So I think the issue here, once again, is how do we how can we avoid letting big tech companies like Facebook and Twitter become the arbiters of freedom of speech? That is a very dangerous position, because it gives a lot of power to one editorial position. So I think that the example you raised there highlights that very, very well.
So the final question is, you've got the Johnson government in the UK, which is a Tory Conservative government. You've got a Conservative governor in Florida moving against deplatforming. Why wouldn't the Morrison government move in this direction as well, of trying to protect freedom of expression online?
Well, look, I'm certainly hoping that we do that, and I'm certainly pushing that we do. I mean, as I said, I think one of the starting points has to be, given the complexity of this nature, is a proper investigation. I mean, I think we need to know what is really going on. One of the issues here is that we don't really have any concrete proof about these processes, shadow banning, deplatforming, all of these sorts of things. We need to get evidence, and these committees can do that. I think that has to be the starting point. But certainly, I think there is a need for all governments that believe in freedom of speech and democracy, to have a very careful look at this scenario now, because it's not a left or right-wing issue. This is a democracy issue. The change in control editorial positions of these companies can change very dramatically overnight, and in one era they might be conservative-leaning, and the other era they might be left-wing. That's not good for any of us. We want a fair and balanced media sector, and that includes social media.
Yep, thanks very much for that. We'll keep an eye on just how that develops with your push for an inquiry, and also whether the Morrison government makes some movement in this direction. Thanks for joining us during a sitting day on Flow.
That's great. Thanks, Ricky.